experienced a lot of desertions, a lot of surrenders. Resistance is not consistent up and down the line. Some areas there are still Ukrainians fighting as fiercely as they can, but there are many other areas where they are not. I think the real question is, what do the Russians do? I know from everything that I've been able to find out from day one that the last thing that President Putin and his government wants to do is rule Ukrainians. In other words, they're sitting right now on territory that is historically Russian, and for the most part, populated by Russians. Russian-speaking Ukrainians, they call them, but they're really Russians. Obviously, he has a permanent interest in two more areas. One is Kharkov, and the other is Odessa, both historically Russian cities, Russian-speaking cities, not Ukrainian. But beyond that, the rest of the country is in fact Ukrainian. Now, the further west you go, the more thoroughly ethnically Ukrainian, as well as linguistically and culturally Ukrainian the country is. But the Russians don't want to intrude there. They would prefer that those people rule themselves. The problem is they don't want it to become this rump state part of NATO. They want it to be neutral. They don't want it to be a platform for attack against Russia. That remains their permanent bottom line. So they're going to look to the Europeans. I don't think they expect us to change our views or adapt in any way. So I think instead they're looking at the Europeans right now, and let's look at Europe. Europe is running into very serious financial and economic trouble. I don't think anybody has missed what's happened in Germany, which is the ultimate engine of scientific industrial power in Europe. It's been on a suicidal path now for months, and the German population is very unhappy with it. But at the same time, more and more Germans, in fact, more and more Poles and others have figured out this tremendous Soviet-like threat from Russia isn't coming. The Russians are not going to invade Eastern Europe. They don't want to invade Eastern Europe. And they're beginning to look internally at their own societies. And Germany, France, parts of Scandinavia, Italy are overwhelmed and overloaded with people that were brought in 2015 and after, mostly from the Middle East and Africa, that most Europeans have now discovered are never going to assimilate, did not come to assimilate, and either have to be expelled and returned to where they came from, or the Europeans themselves face destruction. Now, this doesn't have to be exclusively violent. It can simply come over generations through reproduction. But it's very obvious that Europe has serious troubles inside itself that have nothing to do with what's happened in Ukraine. And those troubles are going to have to be addressed in some fashion. So I think the hope is, I suspect in the Kremlin, that there will be somebody to talk to in Berlin eventually, somebody to talk to in Warsaw, somebody to talk to in Vilnius, somebody to talk to in Helsinki and Stockholm that is sober-minded and realizes there's no imminent threat from Russia. The threat is internal. When that happens, I think they expect to get some sort of settlement. I have always questioned NATO's viability once this war began. I still doubt seriously that the NATO alliance as we've known it will survive. I think eventually something else will replace it that is purely European. Because again, the United States has its own set of problems. If you ask Americans what is the most serious national security threat, they'll tell you the southern border, the influx of millions of illegals that should not be in our country. And we too face difficult times ahead economically and financially. Though we won't admit it publicly, we do. You know, our debt to GDP ratio is over 120%, which seems small when you compare that to Japan's problem. But we have other problems to do with the absence of our manufacturing base. It's a fraction of what it used to be. How do we employ people that have no skills, who are pouring into our country that we can't find housing for? I mean, these things are disastrous things to have to face up to. No one wants to face it in Washington. Washington has almost become Disneyland on the Potomac, where they are not living in a realistic world. They're living in a fantasy world. And this is back to the Middle East. Well, we'll send the Navy. Well, the Navy today is not the Navy that it was 30 years ago. And more important, our Navy is still structured for the Second World War in terms of how it's organized and how we plan to fight. And technology has changed. Those things don't work as they once did. And we're going to face adversaries that fight us differently, for which we're not prepared. This is what we've seen in the Ukraine. We keep boasting about the best trained and largest and most capable army in NATO was Ukraine's army. Well, that hasn't worked out very well, because the Ukrainians were in fact trained by us. Our sainted leaders in uniform did advise them. It's been a disaster. So how will things turn out in the Middle East with new states and new military establishments like the ones in Iran and Turkey, also as part of the regional equation arrayed against us, against Israel, and against the United States? I don't know, but I don't think it'll go well. So on the one hand, Henry James, the famous author in England, once said, "Sacred cows are never slain, they simply vanish." I think Ukraine is just going to vanish. The question is, what happens in the Middle East? That's a tougher nut to crack. That's not going to simply vanish. Do we have to fight more there, endure destruction, embarrassment, losses of our own, before people sober up and recognize this is too dangerous to continue? We convene a conference and the great powers come together and decide we're going to have to divide this child one way or another to put an end to this. I don't know. But we don't live in 1879. We don't have Disraeli. We don't have Bismarck. We don't have Gorshakov. We don't have those kinds of people on the stage, certainly not in Washington. And as a result, I think we're going to hit a brick wall in the Middle East at some point before anything changes at all.
Well, it seems that by attempting to help one side, we've contributed to make some conflicts unresolvable. I'm thinking, well, first in Ukraine, I think that conflict could have been resolved very easily, as neutrality would have resolved that issue altogether, and it simply would have to be NATO saying, we're not going to expand, and then there wouldn't have been a conflict. But of course, now that we pushed all in, and Russia decided to solve it itself by seizing Ukrainian territory, there's simply, I don't see any settlement in which there can be an agreement. But my question was about a similar issue in Israel, because it would seem as if the two-state solution could have been a way to solve this, but it's that ship has probably sailed, because I saw this article now in Times of Israel a few months back, pointing out that in Israel, if you include West Bank, Gaza, the population between the Israelis and non-Israeli Jews are now almost the same. Some even have that the Palestinians plus Arabs, the non-Jewish population are now slightly larger. So it begs the question, how, besides this very specific conflict, what would be the wider solution now? Because you can't, if you can't integrate, you can't preserve a Jewish nation state if the Jews are the minority. So if there's no two-state solution, how can this? Well, what can you do? Do you expel the population? Do you set up systems where two sets of rules, some refer to as apartheid, one set of rules for the Palestinians, another for the Israelis? But if this is the case, you're going to have it's going to have a perpetual conflict. So is there any solutions at all to this conflict? Because it looks like this is becoming a big showdown where, as Erdogan said, a possible conflict between the cross and the crescent. This is quite dramatic.
Well, remember, Solzhenitsyn, before he died, stated publicly that the war between East and West was over. The war between North and South was only just beginning. I hope not, because I think that's another war we can avoid. But you're not going to avoid it by forcibly integrating Israelis with Muslim Arabs. That's not going to work. So that's off the table. But you've got to have a conference involving the United States and the other great powers, where the United States listens to what the other great powers had to say and listens to the other states in the region. We have a bad habit of tuning out whatever we don't want to hear and listening exclusively to what the Israeli leadership says it once and then doing it. If we continue down this road, I fear for Israel's existence, because I just don't think that there's enough military power available to deal with the inevitability of the kind of war we just described, particularly if it involves the Turks and the Iranians as well as the Arabs, with Russia standing in the background. People mention China. China has its own internal problems. It's got severe economic difficulties right at the moment. Chinese have no real martial history at all. They do not have a history of invading other people's countries. There's no appetite for it. But what the Chinese do want is peace and stability, because they're very dependent upon the oil and natural gas that comes out of the Middle East, as well as much of the food that comes out of Africa. So their interest is in finding a solution and helping to subsidize that solution if it can be found. At the moment, no one is in the listening mode in Washington. And it's very clear that Mr. Netanyahu is not going to listen to anything except more ammunition, more support to kill more of his enemies. So until Mr. Netanyahu vanishes from the scene and the Israelis change their direction, I don't see any change, period, because we have a government that seems to be feckless. Our government is just there. Oh, all right, you want more, we send you more. We want you to kill Russians, we hate Russians, which makes no sense. Now we're saying we'll give you whatever you want because we hate your enemies too. Your enemies are ours. That's not really true. We've had very good relations with many, many countries in the Middle East for a long time. I certainly don't want to go to war with the Turks or the Iranians, and I think we could have good relations with those countries as we've had them in the past. But there are people in Washington that are dead set against it. So as long as we are in this rigid, inflexible mode of it's our way or the highway, the rest of the world is not going to take our highway. And I think it's a mistake to believe that the rest of the world is afraid of us. I don't think they are. I think they sense that we are weaker than we were 30 years ago. And indeed we are. They're not stupid. They're not ignorant. They can view the economic and financial situations that exist in our countries. So I don't have a good answer for you. I fear, as I said at the beginning, that we will lead, or Israel will lead itself, but we'll certainly help them down this road into a hell of our own making if we're not careful. And the outcome will be Ukraine in the Middle East. I certainly don't want that. So I'm all for somebody sitting down and looking carefully at this and deciding on another way. But I can't recommend anything in the current set of circumstances because there's no willingness to accept any suggestions. That's the best I can say.
Yeah, I guess last short question would be: how do you see the conflict in Israel impacting the relations between Russia and Turkey? Of course, I'm much like you stated now. I think it's a lot of people in the US would be quite apprehensive to go to war with any of the major Arab states, being, Egypt or, any of the Gulf states for that matter. But the issue of Turkey, that is, if Turkey would intervene, this will almost be incomprehensible. But I was curious, how would this affect Russia and Turkey? Because in many ways they are on opposite sides. In Syria, they're on opposite side. The Turks were trying to be very neutral in Ukraine, but they still provided plenty of support. But nonetheless, they looked after their own interests. It was understood. But now Russia and Turkey see themselves somewhat sharing the position, even though the Turks are much, much stronger in their language. And the Russians obviously would never intervene directly against the Israelis. That could never happen.
Well, I disagree with that. I think that could happen.
Really?
Oh, yes. And directly against us. I think that's a mistake to assume that. But Russia isn't going to come in anytime soon. There's an old proverb about the Russians that people in Eastern Europe repeat from time to time. The Russians are slow to mount, but when they do, they ride fast. In other words, the Russians are cautious. They do not move recklessly as we do. They think things through. They look at their own interests and the interests of those around them. The Turks and the Russians, I sat down recently and tried to count the number of conflicts and wars that the Russians and Turks fought against each other. It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 or 60. So there are no illusions about the past, and Russian and Turkish interests are not identical, but they have managed to come to solutions in the Caucasus, and they have come to solutions down in Ossetia, in southern Ossetia, and they've worked together when it has been necessary to do so. And Mr. Putin was very helpful to Mr. Erdogan in internal crises when we certainly did nothing. So I think they are capable of putting aside their differences. But one of the things that worries me is there's a tendency in Washington to regard Mr. Erdogan as just a blowhard. And he's not. He's very serious. There's a reason he's still in power after all of these years. And he's poured a lot of money into the Turkish military. So he's not bluffing. And I think we thought that Mr. Putin was bluffing for many years when he continued to tell us what he would or would not tolerate. So I think the problem now is not so much what will they do. I think we know what they will eventually do if pushed hard enough. The question is, what are we going to do? What are we going to do to prevent it? Syria could become a very useful highway for Turkish forces to move very rapidly from one end of Syria to the other and reach the Golan Heights in the space of 12 to 18 hours with hundreds of thousands of troops. And Mr. Assad in Damascus and his government are not going to stand in the way, given the situation that is developing in the region, because they too are Muslims. They may be different, they may not share all the same views, but like the Iranians, they can agree with the Turks on what should happen to Israel if Israel does not stop what it's doing right now. So I think we should not underestimate the readiness of the Russians to back the Iranians and potentially cooperate with the Turks against Israel and the United States in the Mediterranean. In fact, I would go one step further. If you talk to anyone in Russia who is familiar with the situation, knows the Russian armed forces, they will tell you that the Russians would like nothing better than to send some of our ships to the bottom in the Mediterranean. Just imagine you're a Russian and you look at what we have tried to do to them in Ukraine. You listen to the stupid, utterly incautious statements made by people like President Biden and the Secretary of State, Blinken, and a host of other people, Sullivan, fools in the Senate, saying, well, the Ukrainians are killing Russians. The more they kill, the better. What kind of a remark is that? Since when do we hate Russians? It's absurd. And the Russians have not forgotten those things. And if the opportunity presents itself to do serious damage to us, they'll take it. And remember, we still have to project power 6,000-7,000 miles away from North America. And projecting that power is not easy, it's expensive, it's difficult, and it's fragile. If Russia comes into the war in any way, shape, or form, they have submarines that can operate in the Atlantic and prevent anything we want to send in terms of reinforcement to the Middle East from ever reaching it. We need to think. Frederick the Great once said, don't plan for what you think the enemy will do. Plan for the worst thing your opponent can do to you. He was right. We're not thinking about that.